Welcome back to Lesson 12. Today we're going to talk about manifest destiny during the Antebellum era. In the last few lessons, we've been talking about the Antebellum era, this time period after the War of 1812 to the American Civil War. So we're talking about the years between 1815 to about 1860. We have several objectives for Lesson 12. They include defining manifest destiny, analyzing westward settlement and settlers and natives relations during the antebellum era, and discussing the Mexican-American War and its significance to westward expansion. Today I want to start the lesson by looking at this painting. It's a painting by John Gass. It's called The American Progress, Spirit of the Frontier, and Gass paints this in 1872. I want you to look at the painting and think about what you see here. There's several things that you'll notice in this painting. You'll see Lady Liberty spreading a telegraph wire and a book, and it says school book, so she's expanding American education and thought with her as she moves west. You'll also see white settlers down at the bottom. If you look at the right, some are settling as farmers, and others are going to the west as adventurers. Some may participate in the 1849 gold rush. You also see Native Americans being pushed westward and their food source, the bison, running away and depleting. If you look at the top right, American cities in the east are expanding their market and going into the west, and trains and new technologies are being brought west as well. So this really describes westward expansion. Today we're looking at westward expansion and westward settlement. So to understand that, we need to think about this question. How did the United States get territories in the West? And we've already answered that one time with one example, the Louisiana Purchase. It takes place during Thomas Jefferson's presidency in 1803 when the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory from France. And that territory is in tan on this map. The United States will also acquire territory in the 1840s and 1850s. The Oregon Treaty is negotiated in 1846 between the United States and Great Britain, and it establishes the boundaries of the Oregon Country, and the United States has control of this area in green, the Oregon Country. Another example is a war that takes place, the Mexican-American War, and it lasts from 1846 to 1848. The outcome of that war is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, it outlines Mexican cession of land, and this is the reddish-orange color on the map, but it's called Mexican cession. We're going to talk more about that in this lesson. And then finally, there's the Gadsden Purchase, and this is this little blue territory right north of Mexico here, and it takes place in 1853 and 1854, but it's a purchase from the United States. The United States buys this land from Mexico. We're going to talk more about it as we move forward. So why do Americans settle the West during the antebellum era? There are several reasons, including economic and ideological reasons. If we think about the United States in 1815, much of the land in the eastern part of the United States is already settled, already occupied. So a lot of people do not have opportunities to purchase farms in the east, and some of them have to look for wage labor. They may be working in factories in the 1820s and 1830s. So many Americans begin to look to the West as a land of opportunity. Some may want to purchase land from the government and create farms in the West. Others may see the West as a land of vast natural resources, and this would be an opportunity for them. For instance, gold is found in California, and several Americans will go to California when they get gold fever. Another reason Americans go west is ideological. Before 1845, this ideological reason doesn't have a name, but it is taking place. The name that it eventually gets is manifest destiny. But let's talk about this ideological reason and the components of the ideological reason to go west and settle the West. First, many Americans believed that the United States had specific American values and institutions, and they really believed that they were better than any other institutions or values in the Western Hemisphere, and that the United States should protect the hemisphere. An example of this is the Monroe Doctrine. being issued. We've already talked about it, but it's an example of the United States trying to be a leader in the Western Hemisphere. The second part of this ideological reason to go west is Americans believe that the United States should control the land on the North American continent. They believe that this land should be under American politics, and they believe that Americans should be settling this land and bringing about what they considered agricultural improvements to the land. The third reason is they believe that God has ordained them to take this land and to spread democracy into this land. In 1845, John O'Sullivan gives a name to this ideology. He says it is, quote, our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions, end quote. And this quote tells you a lot about what he's thinking about manifest destiny, and it tells a lot about this ideology. Number one, he says that it is our manifest destiny. He is talking about white American settlers. He believes it's destined for them to take this. He also says to overspread the continent, so that tells you again that this belief is taking over the entire continent. And he uses the word providence, and he capitalizes the P, so he's talking about God. He's basically saying that God has given Americans the right to take this land. And he also mentions the population growth. He really believes that God has created this avenue for Americans to expand west as their population is increasing. So he really believes that expansion is necessary for the United States. There are several people that want to expand westward, but there's one very strong group that advocates for expanding westward. Many of the members of this movement are in the Democratic Party. It's called the Young America Movement. The Young American Movement are going to promote unity in the United States by promoting American exceptionalism, this belief that the United States is the best. They also promote territorial expansion, spreading democracy, and economic expansion. So they're really going to promote things that bring Americans together. At the same time, they're going to downplay the antebellum sectional tensions that are going on. So they are pro-expansion. But there are going to be some people that are anti-expansion. The opponents to manifest destiny are going to criticize the young Americans. An example is the Whig political party that we've talked about. Some people that are part of the Whig party say that the United States are supposed to lead by example, not by conquest or taking land from others. But while there are some anti-expansionists, the United States is going to expand during the antebellum era. Today we're really talking about territorial expansion during the antebellum era. And for the most part we're looking at the westward expansion. But there's also territorial expansion in the South when we talk about Florida. The United States will acquire Florida in 1819 under the Adam-Onez Treaty. But we really need to back up a minute and talk about what leads up to this. And part of it deals with American exception, this idea that the United States should control this territory. But there's a larger history here. By the 1810s, there are a group of Anglo settlers, that means they're English settlers, that are living on plantations along the St. Johns River. So they're living very near the Georgia border in Spanish Florida. Many of these Anglo settlers are going to be slave smugglers. They will bring slaves into the United States, which is illegal at this time because the United States banned the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, January 1st, 1808. At the same time, American slave owners are really upset because there are a number of slaves that have run away to Florida, and they run away to areas that are controlled by Native Americans, like the Seminoles, and these American slave owners really want the United States government to confront the Spanish authorities. If a slave escaped to Spanish Florida, they would be free. These southern slave owners were very nervous about armed black men in Florida. By the time that the War of 1812 breaks out, there will be several Georgia slave owners that really view this as an opportunity to attack Spanish and British controlled plantations along the St. Johns River. Eventually, the United States government will get involved. On July 27, 1816, the United States Army attacks a fort, and it's called the Negro Fort, and it's about 60 miles south of Georgia. During this attack, the United States Army kills about 270 people at the fort. The following year, the United States government will send General Andrew Jackson into Florida. He will invade Florida in 1817, and this starts the First Seminole War. The Seminole people occupied a large area of territory. They controlled the land from the Apalachicola River to central Florida, where the wetland prairies were in central Florida. They were a very powerful tribe. By this time, many of the Seminole people, and they're really Seminole and Creek people, but the Americans just lumped them together and called them Seminoles, have established settlements. They are farming, they have tilt fields, and they have cattle, and they're really occupying the northern third of Florida. American settlers really want to occupy this land and control the agriculture there, and Spain's really having a hard time controlling this territory. So, with the fact that there's the First Seminole War going on and the United States is getting involved, the Spanish began to think about selling Florida. The Spanish and the Americans negotiated an agreement called the Adams-Onez Treaty in 1819, and the United States acquires Florida for $5 million. After the Adams-Onez Treaty in 1819, there will be several settlers from America come into Florida and live there in the Florida Territory. By 1835, tensions really break out, and a new war starts called the Second Seminole War. And the name is a little bit misleading. The reason that the war breaks out is because in the Seminole Territory, there are a lot of free black men and women living there, and there are also a lot of escaped slaves that are living in the Seminole District. This really makes slave owners uncomfortable. The leader of the American Army, a man named General Thomas Sidney Jessup, he really says that this conflict, the Second Seminole War, was an issue with these free black men and women and escaped slaves more so than it was with the Seminole people. That's not 100% true because the war is between the United States and the Seminole people. By the end of the war in 1842, 4,000 Seminoles will be removed from Florida and moved to the Indian Territory. And many American settlers will push into the Seminoles' territory and take their land and farm there. So 4,000 Seminoles are removed from Florida, and the Seminoles are losing their land. American settlers in the Florida Territory will push for statehood, and Florida becomes a state in 1845, and white settlers will continue to push the Seminole people out of Florida. So as we talk about the Seminoles in Florida in the previous slide, this is a really good time to recap on Native American policies in the United States during the 1830s. When Andrew Jackson takes office, he asked Congress to pass an Indian Removal Act, and they do this in 1830, and it really impacts the 5 civilized tribes, and this is the term that was used at the time. These are the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, Creek, and Cherokee people, and as we talked about, many of these Seminoles will be removed from Florida. We focused mostly on the Cherokee Nation. We looked at the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia Supreme Court case, where the Supreme Court ruled that the Cherokee Nations and other Native American tribes are not considered a nation. They were considered dependent nations, but not a foreign sovereign nation. We also looked at the Supreme Court case, Worcester versus Georgia, and it happens in 1832, and it reverses that and says that Native American nations are independent sovereign nations. We've also mentioned the Trail of Tears, the removal of Native Americans from the Southeast to the Indian Territory. And then we later looked at the Black Hawk War, this war in Illinois between Black Hawk, a leader of the Fox and Sauk nations. But this is just a brief recap to remember as you're thinking about Florida. When the United States is expanding its territory into Florida, it is going to push the Seminoles out of Florida and take over their land. But there are also Native American tribes that live in the West, and as Americans are settling the West, they will encounter these Native American people. Many American settlers believe that the West is uninhabited. There aren't people there. There are a large number of Native Americans in the West during the 1800s. One of the most powerful groups are the Comanches. Beginning in the late 18th century or the late 1700s, the Comanches really become very powerful in the southern plain region. So this is the present-day southwestern United States. The Comanche people adapted. They adapted to the horse culture that was first introduced to them by the Spanish. They had transitioned from a foraging economy into hunting and agricultural lifestyle. After 1821, Mexico is a nation and they claim the region that the Comanche people lived in as part of northern Mexico. It was part of Mexico's northern frontier. But Mexico really had little control over this area. The Comanche really dominated that area. They were in power and they controlled the economy of the southern plains in the 1820s and 1830s. In the 1830s, the Comanches break their peaceful relationship with Mexico and they began raiding northern Mexico and taking goods and items. And at the same time, the Comanche people are building a relationship with Anglo-American traders in Texas. So tensions are going to develop between the Comanches and the Mexicans. By 1840, the Comanche people control this entire territory within this red circle here, and it's called Comanchera. And they're very involved in trading with Texas traders, so these Anglo-Americans that have settled in Texas. Comanche power really peaks in the 1840s, and by trading with Texas and raiding northern Mexico, the Comanches really controlled trade in goods like livestock and trade good in this territory during the 1840s. But the Mexican-American War will kind of interrupt this trade, and we're going to talk more about the Mexican-American War in a moment. Another area that Mexico struggles to control after independence is the Great Basin region. The Great Basin is an area that is occupied by several Native Americans, including the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, but others also want to control this area. Mexican officials that want to control this territory. Anglo-American traders that are entering the area to try to sell commodities there. And then you've got a religious group like the Mormons that settle in this area. Salt Lake City is right in the Great Basin. So you've got a lot of people attempting to control this one region, the Great Basin region, and they're actually people that live there, the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. So they're all competing over this land and the resources in this land. For that reason, there's going to be a lot of violence in the Great Basin region. As American settlers are taking land from Native Americans in the South, and as they're exploring the West and encountering new Native American groups, the federal government is attempting to establish policies to address Native Americans. These policies during the Antebellum era often are called the civilization or civilized policies. The author of the majority of the civilization policy is one man named Thomas L. McKinney. Thomas L. McKinney was the superintendent of Indian Trade from 1816 to 1822, and later the superintendent of Indian Affairs from 1824 to 1830. And he's going to write up this civilization policy. He believed that Native Americans were morally and intellectually equal to whites. He also believed that the Native Americans needed a national Native American school system. He goes to Congress to ask for funding for this Native American school system, but Congress rejects this plan and instead passes something called the Civilization Fund Act of 1819. The Civilization Fund Act provides $10,000 annually, and it would be given to a society that funded missionaries, and these missionaries would establish schools among Native American tribes. This act does provide money for schooling for Native Americans, but it's under the Civilization Program. The Civilization Program also allowed the federal government to take more land from Native Americans. There's several treaties that are signed under this civilization policy. One example is the Treaty of Openstax in 1820, and it's made with the Choctaw Nation. This Treaty of Openstax led to land secession and also had specific requirements for education for Native Americans. The Treaty of Openstax was this treaty between the United States and the Choctaw people. The main people involved in the negotiation were Andrew Jackson, Thomas Hines, and Pushmataha. Pushmataha is the leader of the Choctaw people. But the Choctaw people will lose a lot of land in Mississippi under this Treaty of Openstax. There are several other examples, but basically the federal government is going to sign treaties with Native American groups. They will be forced to give land to the United States. But many of these land cessions do include these educational provisions that will provide school systems for Native Americans. So we've talked a little bit about how the American government addresses Native Americans that are in the West or that are being relocated to the West. And now we're going to talk a little bit about who is going west and where they're going. Who went west in the antebellum era? Most of the time, it is white families settling in the West before the gold rush. So after the gold rush in 1849, that's going to change. After that time period, you're going to see young men going west. But before 1849, families are going west. Mostly white American families. Where are they going? Before 1846, most of these settlers are settling between the Appalachian Mountain and the Mississippi River. The reason being is this is the territory that is available. The Louisiana Purchase took place in 1803 and opened up all that territory, and so that's why most people are settling in this region before 1846. But after the Mexican-American War, we're going to see Americans moving toward the West Coast and moving further west. So most of the people that settle in the West before 1846 are living between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, and they mostly live close to water. They really saw moving to the West as an opportunity for them. If you look at the land in the eastern part of the United States during this time period, there's not much land left. There's a lot of competition for good land. Also, the soil is not as fertile as it once was. In the previous lesson, we talked about the Chesapeake, how the soil has depleted. So many people that are from the east, they move to live in the West, and they really see it as an opportunity for farming. When these people move to the West, they're bringing their ideas and thoughts with them, and one thing that they bring with them is their ideas about gender roles. We've talked about gender during the antebellum era a little bit. There's this concept called separate spheres where the woman operates in the domestic sphere or the household sphere. She lives and works inside the home, and the other sphere, the other separate sphere, is the man's domain, and they work outside of the home. Now, this has been challenged a little bit during the antebellum era and during this market revolution that we've talked about. We talked about young single women leaving the home in the North and going to work at textile mills like Lowell Mills. So ideas about gender roles and the separate sphere are being challenged a little bit during this time period, but they're still being enforced and reinforced by certain groups. So if we talk about gender roles as we look at moving west, they're reinforced. But when we look at this frontier society, it actually provides more opportunities for women. When families move west, husbands need a partner in setting up a homestead and working the field to provide food for the family. And they often find that partner in their wife. So the wives do have some opportunities when they move west. Suitable wives were in short supply in the West, so women could kind of informally negotiate for more power in their household. Other things that are going on in the West as people are living there, this is right in the middle of the market revolution. There are going to be improvements in transportation and internal improvements. Internal improvements are necessary because if they really want to expand the economic market and for people to grow more produce, they need a way to get their product and commodities back to the eastern market. So infrastructure is really going to develop during this time period. You're going to have more roads, more canals, more railroads built during this time period. But there's actually a debate on transportation and internal improvement. Is it an individual's responsibility to improve transportation or internal improvements, or is it the government's responsibility? And in some cases, individuals will take up the responsibility for transportation. In other examples, you'll see the government take up this responsibility. We've looked at some of these improvements in previous lectures, we talked about a national road that was being built in 1811. So it's this federal road that's being built. We also talked about canal, including the Erie Canal that links the Great Lakes to New York City, and early railroads like the Baltimore and Ohio line. But really, it's going to be very important for internal improvement to link this new territory, this Western territory, to the eastern part of the United States and connect the markets. And this is actually a map of the number of railroads in the United States by 1859. So you can see that the United States is becoming more connected. There still is not a transcontinental railroad, so a railroad that would link the east to the west, but they are very close to having a transcontinental railroad. They are actually going to build a transcontinental railroad in the 1860s. The U.S. government sponsors it. In the 1820s and 1830s, Americans are looking for more places to settle in the West, and one place that they're looking toward is Texas. So let's talk a little bit about background on Texas. Before 1821, it was part of the Spanish Empire. In 1821, Mexico gains its independence from Spain, and it is a monarchy to start with, but in 1824, it goes through some restructuring, and in 1824, two areas, Coahuila and Tejas, are combined to be Coahuila y Tejas. One point to make here, Tejas, which will become Texas, its border at this time is at the Nueces River. So it's not at the Rio Grande, it's at the Nueces River. But these two places are put together to make one state, Coahuila y Tejas. And the Mexican government really encourages settlers to live in Coahuila y Tejas. One reason they do this, the Comanches are there, and the Comanches are very powerful in this area, and they really hope to create a buffer zone between Mexico and the Comanche people. So they really encourage new immigrants to live there, and many of the new immigrants that settle in Tejas are going to be from the southern United States. So many of these people will be bringing slaves with them into Mexican Texas. But there's a growing Anglo-American influence in this area, and it creates tension between Mexicans and Anglo-Americans that live in this area. In 1829, Mexico really is going to attempt to address this, and they're also trying to slow down immigration. One thing they do in 1829 is they abolish slavery, and they required all new immigrants to convert to Catholicism. So they really thought that by doing these two things, abolishing slavery and forcing immigrants to convert to Catholicism in Tejas, it would slow down immigration. But American immigrants ignored these requirements, and they brought slaves with them, and they did not convert to Catholicism. In response to this, in 1830, the Mexican government decides that it would completely close their territory to new immigration. But like I said, Americans will ignore this. Many people will come into Texas and they'll actually squat on public land. By 1834, there's an internal conflict in the Mexican government between a group called the Federalists and a group called the Centralists. And there's going to be some fighting between these two groups, and eventually a leader will emerge, and his name is General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, and Santa Anna will become a dictator. He basically gets rid of this Federalist Constitution in 1824, and he really wants to have a central government led by him as a dictator. When this happens, many of the Anglo-American settlers in Mexican Texas really oppose Santa Anna and his thoughts about centralizing the Mexican government. And they come together and meet in November, and they issue a statement. And basically they say that they're committed to the Constitution of 1824, and they declare that Texas was a separate state within Mexico. So that basically they're saying that Texas would be its own state. The Mexican government rejects this, and Texan leaders start to think about abandoning their fight for this 1824 Constitution, and instead they start thinking about declaring independence, and they will declare independence on March 2nd, 1836. From 1835 to 1836, the Texans are going to fight for their independence in the Texas Revolution, and they will be successful and declare independence in 1836, and they'll be the Republic of Texas. There are two very important battles in the Texas Revolution. There's the Battle of the Alamo and the Battle of San Jacinto. The Battle of the Alamo takes place in San Antonio. Santa Anna is going to basically surround the Alamo, and they're going to massacre many of the Texans at the Alamo. And so this really frustrates many Texans, and some of the Texan army has to retreat into East Texas. Eventually, there's going to be more fighting taking place, but on April 21st, 1836, a group of Texans led by Sam Houston are going to attack Santa Anna. They're going to have a surprise attack on Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto. The battle only lasted 18 minutes, and the Texans win. When the Mexicans begin to flee and they try to surrender, the Texans are going to kill many of them because they remember the Alamo. Santa Anna himself is captured, and he is forced to sign a treaty called the Treaty of Velasco on May 14, 1836. In this Treaty of Velasco, Santa Anna agrees to withdraw his army from Texas and acknowledge Texas independence. When Santa Anna is kicked out of office, this new Mexican government does not recognize the Republic of Texas. On March 2nd, 1836, Texans had declared Texas independent from Mexico. They believed the border of Texas was the Rio Grande River. Mexico has always said that Texas' border was the Nueces River, but it's declared independence by May 14, 1836. The Treaty of Velasco acknowledges Texas independence, but that was under Santa Anna, and there's a new Mexican government that takes control, and they do not agree with it. But nevertheless, there's this independent Texas out there, and some people in America began thinking about annexing Texas in the 1830s and early 1840s. Many Americans were afraid to annex Texas because they thought that if they annexed Texas, it would create a war between the United States and Mexico. Another thing that they were anxious about is if the United States annexed Texas, it would throw off the balance between slave states and free states, and they thought that it would add to sectional tension. So, many people do not want to address this issue in the 1830s. But President John Tyler is having some political problems. He has gotten in trouble with the Whig Party, and so President John Tyler really believes that Texas may help his political career, and so he begins negotiating in 1842 to work on annexing Texas. It doesn't take place during his presidency, and there's a political election in 1844, and the person that is chosen to be president in 1844 is a Democrat named James K. Polk. James K. Polk is going to campaign on westward expansion. He promises that the United States will expand westward and incorporate Texas. But before James K. Polk can take office, John Tyler is able to extend an official offer to Texas to join the United States on March 3rd, 1845, and on July 4th, 1845, Texas accepts the offer and becomes part of the United States. So Texas is annexed into the United States on July 4th, 1845. When the United States annexes Texas, it's going to cause tension between Mexico and the United States. So the United States has annexed Texas, but there's still this issue over the Texas border. The Texans believe the border goes to the Rio Grande River. The Mexicans believe it stops at the Nueces River. So there's this issue, this contested land that was in red on the map on the previous slide. In November 1845, President Polk will send a diplomat, his name's John Slidell, to Mexico City. His mission is to purchase that strip of land, that contested area between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande River. He's also supposed to purchase some land in New Mexico and California. But when he gets to Mexico City, the government refuses to receive Slidell. So while this is going on, James K. Polk is preparing for this. He knows that it's not really going to go well, so he sends 4,000 troops so 4,000 men, to the Texas border. They're led by a general named General Zachary Taylor, and they'll go to the border. They're actually going to go to Corpus Christi, Texas, just northeast of the Nueces River. When they get word that Slidell was not received in Mexico City, Polk will order Taylor to cross into this disputed territory. So in January 1846, there's news that Slidell is not able to negotiate, and Zachary Taylor's troops go into this disputed territory. The president had hoped that he would show force and force Mexico to negotiate, but that did not happen. On April 24th, 1846, the Mexican cavalry will attack these United States troops in this disputed territory, and by May 13th, 1846, there's a declaration of war, so the Mexican-American War has officially started. When the war is officially declared, Congress calls for 50,000 volunteers to serve in this Mexican-American War, and thousands of men will join the army, and they'll fight in what is called by the opposition Mr. Polk's War. In early fall of 1846, the United States Army will invade Mexico, and within 1 year, General Winfield Scott's men will take Mexico City. It is a very unpopular war because even though Winfield Scott's men have taken control of Mexico City, it did not end the war. Scott's men will occupy Mexico City for over 4 months while Mexico and the United States negotiate. Though, like I said, the war has been controversial from the beginning. Many of the men that volunteered to fight realized that war wasn't what they expected. Disease killed a lot of American soldiers during this war. Disease killed 7 soldiers to every 1 soldier that died in combat during the Mexican-American War on the American side. There was harsh discipline in the army and conflict among the ranks. Eventually, peace was reached on February 2nd, 1848, and it's reached between the United States and Mexico. It's called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is going to change American territory. Under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which takes place on February 2nd, 1848, the United States gained land that would become the future states of California, Utah, and Nevada, most of Arizona, and part of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. In addition, Mexico was forced to surrender their claims to Texas, and they were forced to recognize the Rio Grande River as the southern border of Texas. The United States offered $15 million for all this territory. The Mexican government did not really have a choice because the American army had been occupying Mexico City for 4 months already. So the Mexican leaders signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. After the Mexican-American War, American settlers continued to move westward, and they continued to want more land. Eventually, by 1853 and 1854, the United States is going to purchase a strip of land from Mexico called the Gadsden Purchase. This strip of land in the peach color here is called the Gadsden Purchase. We can also talk about people traveling west before 1869. So as this new territory is opening up in the west, people are going to settle the west and travel the west. Well, before 1869, there is not a transcontinental railroad, and it's very expensive to travel by train. So most settlers that are going west, that are moving with their families, are going to travel on wagon trains. And there's several trails that these wagon trains travel. The 3 most popular trails that they travel are the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, and the California Trail. And I'm going to give you a specific example by looking at the Oregon Trail. A lot of Americans will travel along the Oregon Trail, and they're trying to settle in the Oregon Territory. There's actually some dispute between the Americans and the British about who occupies the Oregon Territory and where the American territory begins and where the British territory begins and ends. So in 1846, there's a treaty between the Americans and the British. It's called the Oregon Treaty, and it establishes the border of the Oregon Territory is set at the 49th parallel latitude north. And so that sets the boundary of the Oregon Territory. And so more people are going to start settling in the Oregon Territory and traveling to Oregon. And to reach Oregon, they travel on the Oregon Trail. Many of you will be younger and not remember the Oregon Trail game. But if you remember the Oregon Trail game, it is very hard to make it to Oregon in the Oregon Trail video game. A little bit about the Oregon Trail. It's about 2,000 miles long, and from 1845 to 1870, there are about 400,000 travelers that make this 2,000-mile trek. To travel along the Oregon Trail, you really had to come from a moderately prosperous background because you had to have so many supplies to make it to Oregon. If you've played the video game, you know you have to have a lot of beans and ammunition and other goods to make it to Oregon. Well, these people in real life had to plan to make it to Oregon, so they needed to know how much food they needed to make it to Oregon and set up shop in Oregon. They needed to know what kind of supplies they needed to bring with them. So it's very important that you're prepared, because if you ran out of food or anything on your way to Oregon, it would be very, very bad for your journey, because the journey itself is very dangerous. There are snakes on the Oregon Trail, there are animals on the Oregon Trail, and the settlers come in contact with Native Americans as well. The Oregon Trail is very dangerous. In addition to this, many people that travel the Oregon Trail get sick. They may die of dysentery. So the Oregon Trail is a very difficult trail to travel, and you can't just go on the Oregon Trail if you just want to go. You have to prepare. Many people are traveling from St. Louis all the way into Oregon, so it's a very long task, and you have to be very prepared or you will not survive. In 1846, when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is signed, the United States gains the territory of California. And not many Americans live in California when this treaty is signed, but this will change when a gold rush takes place in 1849 and 1850. On January 24th, 1848, a contractor, a man named James W. Marshall, is going to find gold at a man named John Sutter's sawmill land. And this sawmill land is located in the Sacramento Valley in California. Over time, news about the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill will reach many on the East Coast, and many of these adventurers are going to get gold fever and come to California in 1849 and 1850. They're called the 49ers, and they really want to make a fortune for themselves by discovering gold and looking for gold. California grows very quickly in 1849 and 1850, and California in the 1850s will start calling for a transcontinental railroad, a railroad that would connect the East Coast to California, the West Coast. They believed that not only it would make it easier for settlers to reach California, but also for California to be connected to the national market. California would be connected to the Midwest market and the Eastern market, and they could sell goods and get goods on that market. But a transcontinental railroad will not take place in the 1850s. It will be built during the 1860s. But there are these people that come to California during this time period of the gold rush, 1849 and 1850. If we look at towns and cities in California, they grew really quickly. One example is San Francisco. In 1848, it had about 500 people. By 1853, 5 years later, it had 50,000 people. So it goes from 500 to 50,000 in a 5-year period. towns really pop up overnight. There are gold boom towns that just pop up overnight. So as people find gold in specific areas, new towns will pop up, and there are hierarchies in these gold towns. The hierarchy of the gold boom towns really have white landowners and managers at the top of the social hierarchy, with poor white and ethnic minorities working the mines and having several jobs. These boom towns have saloons that pop up, they have supply stores that pop up during this time period. But there are ethnic minorities in California in the 1850s. Chinese and Mexican people made up 1/5 of the mining population in California by the end of the 1850s. They're really seen as ethnic minorities at this time period, and they're at the lower end of the social hierarchy on the frontier towns. There's competition for land, resources, and riches, and it leads to conflicts between white settlers and Native Americans and Mexicans and Chinese. Many of the Chinese that work in the gold mines in the 1850s will work to build the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s. And next week we'll talk more about sectional tension.